what is your channel? What is your go-to-market strategy? And you have to know that from the beginning. And uh, because I'm helping another person right now. I'm running the go-to-market strategy for a AI company in town now, and it's the same, fundamentally, completely different ICP, different technology, different use case, but the core problem of you better figure out what your channel is there. It's a business problem that transcends the technology.
Welcome to the Startup to Exit podcast, where we will bring you world-class entrepreneurs and VCs to share their hard-earned success stories and secrets. This podcast has been brought to you by TIE Seattle. TIE is a global nonprofit that focuses on fostering entrepreneurship. TIE Seattle offers a range of programs, including the Go Vertical Startup Creation Weekend, TIE Entrepreneur Institute, and the TIE Seattle Angel Network. We encourage you to become a TIE member so you can gain access to these great programs. To become a member, please visit www.seattle.tie.org.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our podcast From Startup to Exit. I'm here with my co-host Shirish Nadkarni. My name is Gowri Shankar. We both serve on the board of TIE Seattle, which produces this podcast. First of all, we both want to thank you for all the support that you've given us over the last year, where we have brought this podcast to all of you. And I hope all of you have enjoyed all the content that we are bringing from our guest. We are launching a very special series. We are launching a series that is very close to both our hearts because we are both Seattleites. Microsoft just turned 50, and as a tribute to the company and the impact it's had on the world and our city, we are going to talk to some of the very early executives who shaped and grew the Microsoft brand to what it is today. I hope all of you enjoy it. We will be talking to many of them, and over the time, you will learn a lot of things about the early years of Microsoft. Thank you all, and hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, everyone. Today, we are interviewing Laura Jennings as part of our Microsoft at 50 series. Laura joined in 1988, and she was one of the earliest and highest ranking female executives at Microsoft. And I reported to Laura when I was working on Microsoft Mail, when she was leading the messaging business unit, and then later on at MSN, when we worked on the Hotmail acquisition, as well as getting search launched at Microsoft. So welcome, Laura. It's great to see you after so many years. It's amazing how time has passed.
It is great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. So let us start with the early days of Microsoft. Microsoft was somewhat well known at that time. I remember, Bill was on the cover of Time magazine, but there was still an MS-DOS company. What led you to interview at Microsoft, and how did you decide?
Yeah. So I like to think that Microsoft wasn't that successful. Back in those days, it was really early days. And there was another person who had been an intern at Microsoft who was in my MBA class. So and she spoke very highly of Microsoft, although she didn't end up getting an offer from them to come back. And I already had maybe a dozen job offers coming out of Kellogg, but really late in the season, I decided to come interview at Microsoft just on a whim. And I loved it there. It was a sort of environment where I just felt like I fit. And so it ended up being the absolute, by a long margin, lowest job offer I had coming out of Kellogg. And I decided to take it.
Wow. Did you know anything about options at that time?
Yes, of course I did. Of course I did.
Okay.
And so, yes, using my Black-Scholes formula, my options were worth $55,000.
Wow.
And when I remember talking to Jeff Riggs and telling him, surely I'm gonna make less money coming out of MBA school than I made going in. And he said, hold tight, I'll bring you another offer. It was pouring rain and he met me outside the building. I remember being under his umbrella, hands me an envelope, and the offer is for $1,000 more a year.
Did he give you any more options?
No, no more
No,
options. I wasn't
no more
even
options. Okay.
negotiating. Um, anyway, I took the job.
Yeah,
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
funny.
What a story.
Mm.
That's great. So, what was your first job at Microsoft?
Yeah. So as you pointed out, they had just started hiring these classes of MBAs. And so the way they would assign people to jobs in those days is you would be hired by Microsoft, but you didn't know what your role was going to be. And then in the spring, they would bring the class. I don't know how many there were of us. Let's say there were 15 or so who had been hired by the company. We would all show up for a weekend event. And then during the course of the weekend, people would sort of tap you on the shoulder. It was kind of like sorority or fraternity brush. And then you'd kind of go off in a quiet place and they would tell you what was available and offer you a position. So the person who tapped me on the shoulder was Mike Slade. And he said, you're going to work for me, but I've got 3 different roles. Which of these interest you? So we're working on this new database. We have our word processing business, which is big and successful. And then we've got this idea, we've got this kind of weird thing where we have a bunch of applications for the Mac platform, but we don't have anybody thinking about that as a whole. And so 10 times out of 10, if you make me an offer like that, I'll take the weird job. And so that's how I ended up doing what I did, which was to launch the original Microsoft Office, which we did on the Mac in 1989 or 90.
So, I didn't know that actually, that you worked on Microsoft Office. I mean, we interviewed Jeff Rakes, who was, I guess, the original ideator on Microsoft Office. But that was a huge move for Microsoft,
It was.
especially, yeah, because it wasn't clear that consumers would buy a bundle as opposed to buying best of breed.
No, exactly. So
Yeah.
there had been a test. It was called the business bundle, had been done before I started at Microsoft, maybe a year before. So the idea had been tested, but it was controversial. Yeah, this idea of bundling things together. And if you were a product manager for one of the successful products like Word or Excel, you absolutely positively did not like this idea. And so there was a lot of skepticism. Not only would consumers accept it, but there was internal disagreement and internal scuffling around the idea as well, which, in those early days of Microsoft was not unusual.
Great. So, in your class, were there many women who joined at that time? Or were you the only female?
No, I was not the only female. I still have very dear friends who joined at the same time. But, if you look at the graduating classes of MBAs in that time period, it was about 20% female. So I'll bet our class was about that.
Got it. Got it. In my class, I had Melinda. I think she
Right.
was the only female
Yeah.
in my class. We actually worked together on something called Word Mail. She was a product manager on Word, and I was a product manager on Microsoft Mail.
Yeah.
It's kind of
Wait,
interesting. Yeah.
this issue, so Melinda was one of the people I interviewed with when I came out. And again, just there was this feeling of belonging, like these are people, there's so much opportunity here to invent things. Things are moving really rapidly. And
Right.
she was one of the people who convinced me to join.
Got it. So, as a new female employee, how did you, and most of your colleagues, you said you had more women in your class, perhaps compared to mine. But this was still the early days. And did you, what was the experience like? Was it fairly normal, or did you have, were you assigned mentors because you're female?
No, there
No.
was no mentorship back in those days. Okay, so I had been an engineering student as an
Yeah.
undergrad. So,
Yeah.
I was used to an environment like there aren't very many women in theoretical and applied mechanics courses. I mean, so, when you come from that world and then you go through MBA school, it didn't seem that unusual to be in an environment that was male dominated. It seemed pretty normal to
Hmm.
me. And
Hmm.
everybody was working really hard. So I don't think the gender issue was really an important one. Where it became an issue is, of course, later when people started getting married and having kids.
Hmm.
So, um, as a female vice president, and there had been other female vice presidents who had children, but they all had had them before being a Microsoft vice president, right? So as a pregnant female vice president, I really felt a lot of pressure,
Hmm.
ridiculously in hindsight, to kind of ignore the fact that I was president or pregnant. So, for example, when I had my second child,
Hmm.
I had her on a Friday, and I was in the office on Monday
Seriously?
with
Oh my God.
my baby and my mother in tow. I didn't stay long, but there was a new employee that we had just recruited away from another big company. It was going to be his first day. And so, absolutely, 3 days later, there I was doing that. And that's the kind of thing that now we look at as being pretty crazy. But at the time, I felt so much pressure to behave in a way that would help other women behind me. And thank goodness that is, I think those days of doing crazy stuff like that are long gone.
Got it. But it's just pressure you're putting on yourself in a sense, or did you have peer pressure to come
No, well,
back?
people would say things to me about how they're watching, and so I think it was a combination of both.
Hmm, I see. Got it. Got it. So after leading Microsoft Office on the Macintosh, then you became group product manager for Microsoft Mail, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so
Uh, no, yeah, go ahead.
Mike Maples was the president at that point, and he kept calling me to his office and
Mm,
saying, we'd really like you to go do work on email. And although we ran our business on email, of course, at Microsoft,
yeah.
it wasn't, I mean, we had no business to speak of. Of course, we bought Network Courier
Yeah.
up in Vancouver, and, they were doing 9 million a year. I mean, I had, I thought the office thing went pretty well. So this felt like a big demotion. Uh, but it was fascinating, right? So we took this little business, and then we took some gateway technology coming out of the Windows group, and we put that together, and eventually we launched Microsoft Exchange. So that was a pretty fascinating time. But, you know, I remember I mean, it's crazy to think about, but I actually would go around the world and I would give speeches about the value of store and forward messaging.
Right.
This is
And
my
X dot
life.
and X dot 400. Remember
Yeah.
that?
Yes. Right. Exactly.
Mm,
It's just nuts to think
extraordinary.
about
Right.
now. But,
Right.
that was that way. So we're moving, the world is moving from mainframe computing to distributed desktop computing, and we were evangelists for that wave of computing while we're trying to sell a specific product.
Yeah. Yeah. So at that time, we were in a major battle with Lotus, which had CC Mail and Lotus Notes.
Right.
I remember one of the major battles we fought was around the messaging API. We had something called Mappy, and then Lotus had
Right.
something called Vim. But we
Right.
ultimately beat Lotus both on Mappy and on Exchange versus Lotus Notes. How did that? What are some of the strategies that you implemented to win those battles?
Well, I think that I don't remember the specifics, but I think that the takeaway is the power of having partners, right? So
Hmm.
if you're running a product group like I were, you like to think that you're you're responsible for success. But really, the infrastructure you have of people elsewhere in the company who are building developer momentum behind your platform just cannot be underestimated. And I think going to market with that behind you and the strength of people who are getting the development community to choose your particular API set to build on your platform is really what won that battle. Not anything we really did in the product group, if I'm being honest.
Got it. So after messaging, you took on a role with the interactive TV effort,
Right.
which is under Craig Mundy. I understand Craig Mundy, by the way, Paul Moritz told us that Craig Mundy was one of the guys who negotiated the OpenAI agreement. I don't know if you knew that.
No, but
Yeah,
nothing surprises me about Craig Mundy. He's
right.
brilliant.
Yeah, yeah. So Microsoft invested a lot of effort into interactive TV to get cable TV platforms to adopt it, etc. But then ultimately decided to focus on the open internet, and that's when you took on the leadership role for MSN. But
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about what happened in that journey.
Yeah. So Craig was working with Nathan Mervold in this group that we did a lot of interesting things that were kind of before their time. So we did the first watch that communicated with your desktop computer. Uh, we spent a lot of time. We did the home of the future. Do you remember that? We
Yeah,
built a wired home so we could experiment with how people use technology on their refrigerators, et cetera, and would
yeah,
bring people in to observe. And then I spent a lot of time thinking about interactive TV and, the technology, the network wasn't there. In fact, one of the when after I left Microsoft and I was a VC, one of the companies I founded was or I funded Isilon, which understood that the storage needs for that type of streaming environment were fundamentally different from the storage needs for traditional computing. It wasn't just the network bandwidth, but it was lots of pieces of foundational technology were not ready there for interactive TV, but we spent a lot of time thinking about it.
got it, got it. So when did you take on the role at MSN?
I took on the role at MSN after launch. So, like everything at Microsoft, it was launched everywhere we were. So
Yeah,
it was launched in whatever that was, 50 something countries, built on a proprietary X25 network, um, and right at the wrong time because that's when the world is moving to the internet. So I took over after launch, maybe 6 months after the launch of MSN, and really was responsible for then exiting all but 7 of those countries that we had launched in and rebuilding the technology and our whole approach differently.
right,
So you just
right.
couldn't ignore that the world was going to change. And then I think about that as this kind of second fundamental shift in technology from thinking about distributed desktop computing to thinking about software as a service. And MSN was really the first place that Microsoft touched that idea of software as a service as we were rolling out MSN and really trying to figure out what are people going to do on the internet? Should we take what we do in terms of productivity apps and that's what the world is going to look like? Is it going to be entertainment based? And so you see in those early days of MSN, we're spinning out ideas that represent both of those elements, productivity tools and entertainment, as we're trying to figure out what to do and what is the relationship of that to our existing software suites. And so that was so during that transition, we lost $450 million, I think, that first year. And then and wrote a lot of things off on the balance sheet, um,
Yeah,
that whole network. And so it was uh, it was a time when, I would present to the board every
mhm,
quarter what was going on. This was before losing a lot of money.
yeah,
Wasn't something that technology companies routinely did.
mhm. Right, right, right. Got it. All right, over to you, Gowri, to explore more about MSN and other initiatives.
Yeah. So, Laura, one of the themes that's emerged talking to all the folks we've talked to as part of the series was uh, convincing the leadership team a change had to be made. They were well invested. They go down these paths, go down, and then you got to make a full-on pivot. And what was because you, having presented to the board, you were convincing Bill and the all of the board, hey, we're going from this to this, which is not as a non-trivial exercise. What was your thinking as to convincing them, hey, this isn't going to work, and we got to do this? Was there some leading indicators that you used, or was it obvious to them, or how did they get convinced?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, well, it was a lot of people, right? I mean, I would say that I don't think Bill is the guy who needed convincing, um, in terms of thinking about where the world is going, and we clearly had been behind. And it took us longer to launch MSN than, and again, I was still sitting over at interactive television land, but it took us longer to do that. We're looking at what other people are doing. I mean, the competitor we had gone to market thinking about was AOL, and the world was changing, and we were losing a lot of money. This was clearly not going to be a successful strategy. So I think it was coming from a lot of different angles that we were thinking about really having to make this change. And really, I have to say, Russ Siegelman, who had been the person before me, who had launched MSN and then left to go work for Kleiner Perkins. I don't know if you talked to him. He largely had fought a lot of that battle. And uh, I think maybe that had something to do with his decision to leave. You'd have to
Mm,
ask Russ about that, but he saw that coming.
mm. So, you were an interactive TV. That means I was thinking that entertainment should be part of this internet when people went. But Microsoft also acquired Hotmail at that point.
Right.
And you had mail. I mean, you were the champion evangelist for Store
Right.
and Forward.
Totally.
I bet that was not, it was like, come on, we could build this in a weekend kind of a thing, right? I mean, it wasn't
Totally.
magic there from a product, but not taking away anything from the founders. You know what I mean? There's the pride in technology. So, what was the journey of that acquisition? How did you guys spot it? How did you convince them? How did you convince your folks,
Okay.
especially convincing somebody as much as Bill to say you got to spend 400 plus $1 million buying this thing?
Yeah, that was a really that was a fascinating time. Okay, so first, the idea came from this really genius of a guy called Shirish Nadkarni, um, who who really had spotted this opportunity. The second thing I will say is that, yeah, store and forward messaging, no big deal. Doing anything at scale is non-trivial, right? So the big argument internally was why we couldn't use our, why is this different than Exchange? It's fundamentally different than Exchange. To think about doing something at the scale of the internet, right? It's very, very different. The third thing was we're all trying to figure out how to get a toehold in this new world, right? So what is it you're trying to own? You have in the same time frame, you have people who are starting to defect for Amazon. And people who aren't paying attention to the fundamental shift are saying at Microsoft, well, why do they want to sell books? Well, that's not what it's about, right? It's controlling the wallet. It's being a
Hmm.
major player, controlling a focal point in
Hmm.
this new world. And
Hmm.
so you also see the evolution, like early evolution of some social platforms, messaging platforms, and they're all about figuring out what are you going to own. You're going to, and in the Hotmail case, what you have is you have this address book
Hmm.
that's quite large, that is
Hmm.
also an asset, plus the understanding of how you build differently when you think you're not building for a really big corporation, but you're building a messaging platform for the world. They're just fundamentally different. And
Hmm.
Sharish, you should comment on this because
Actually, I'll tell you a story that apparently Bill Gates sent out an email to all the executive vice presidents saying, "Hey, I'm going to buy Hotmail for a pretty hefty price. Speak your mind now or forever hold your peace," kind of email. And I came to know about it, and I knew also that most likely the reaction would be negative, and that there would be a chain of negative emails. So I literally ran to Pete Higgins' office and stopped whatever he was doing and said, "Hey, you have to respond to this email." So Pete and I sat together and we composed a piece of email to all, responding to Bill saying, "Hey, no, this is a great acquisition. We should do it, blah, blah, blah." And fortunately, there was no negative response to that because, even at that time, Bill was asking questions, this is Hotmail really an application that people are using, or is it all for spamming? And I think he made the famous comment that I've never seen somebody's business card with a Hotmail email address. So he was skeptical himself. I credit actually Laura and Pete Higgins for really convincing Bill to make that acquisition.
I remember coming home that night after the decision was finally made, because it was controversial at the board level as well, and telling my husband, "Well, I'm going to have to kill myself making this successful, or my career is over."
But Hotmail was Silicon Valley company, right? Sabir Bhatia was running it. And, at the time, these big number acquisitions were still not there. I mean, there were acquisitions happening, but not big number. And the
That's
Silicon
right.
Valley investors could not have just said, "Hey, we go IPO," because Netscape was coming around the corner. I mean, there was lots of things momentum wise from the Valley that would have said, "Why should we sell it to Microsoft?" Right? And because potentially they could have been $1 billion company as opposed to they would say, "Oh, we're only a 400 million." How did you guys convince either the founders or their team that this was a better home, irrespective of the price? Because the price is the price. There was nothing
Well,
around it.
no, the price is part of the price, right?
Hmm.
But the deal was structured so that there was upside, of course.
Mm,
I
mm,
mean, you you have to allow to your point, you have to allow it, particularly in that period, you have to allow the founders to participate in what their vision is for growing the company. So the deal was structured in a way that there was an incentive there to help us make it successful.
mm. So that allowed them. I mean, that almost put MSN into a new category, right? Because now theoretically you had productivity at home. I mean, by email, because email at that time I remember was still a work-related software. I mean, or work-related product. It's not, people didn't bring it home, or there was no such thing. There was some early days of pagers, but still that was considered not the day-to-day thing. So this kind of brought it to the masses, so to speak. I would compare it to the Netflix of today, right? Everybody has to have one. So it's like you open a browser, you had an email account, and everybody touted that they had one.
Right. Yeah. Was something you could do. The
Yeah.
earliest type of productivity software before we were doing everything, right? Booking our restaurants and our travel and everything else we ended up doing online. But
Right, right. And at that time, search was opening up. Was there thinking that you would build search in-house because there was Yahoo, there were others? What was the strategy MSN decided to do on search at that point?
so we took a run many times at acquiring our way into search, uh, many times,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, just were never successful.
Mm-hmm. And so did you then end up doing, I know that there was a partnership that was done with, I think, Ink2Me or something around that time. Was it more so they would just white label it at that point?
I don't remember
Mm-hmm.
exactly the details.
Mm-hmm. Because even later on, there was a run at buying Yahoo. Much
Oh,
later on.
COVID. Yeah, right. No, there were many runs at that.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, But as MSN took hold and it became an internet place, a destination for internet users as opposed to proprietary, and AOL was still, largely proprietary. And then there was
Yes.
these battles of chat, messenger, and mail and other things. And then you came from interactive TV. Was there, I remember a push to get, some kind of video content or some content back end that was just not text. Was since you worked in all parts of it, were you able to string that together at MSN saying, hey, we will be the destination to go to for MSN in those days?
Yeah, we tried that. So one of the early people we hired was an executive producer out of Time Warner,
Mm,
who had, for Time Warner, had been really early in interactive film production at a company called Interfilm. And so we did have we had a suite of entertainment oriented offerings
mm,
with, so you've got the, we're starting companies in the division under Pete that are more productivity focused, and MSN is really focused on Hotmail uh, and doing some entertainment work, which, oh, and brought Michael Kinsley on board and did Slate, and so really you see in that era we're experimenting pretty broadly.
So there was attempts at creating content and bringing content together so that you can, but never in totally into commerce. I mean, even though Amazon was just across the lake,
Exactly.
never into
Never into
commerce.
commerce. Hmm.
So that was interesting, right? Because you could see commerce building, but
Yeah.
you said, that's not what we do. But going back to Hotmail, you mentioned scale was difficult to build compared to Exchange, right? Was that the driver then in the purchase price too? Was it a multiplier of what they'd acquired? I mean, because this seemed like a fairly large number to have come up with, and what was attributed to their IP, so to speak? Because the IP wasn't defendable, so to speak. I mean, it's not, it's protocols at the end of the day. Yes, they did bit scale. I'm not going to take away from them. How did you guys decide this is the number it got to be?
How did we determine the price?
Yeah.
I don't know. Shirish, help me out here. How did we come up with that number?
Well, I
Was
remember we originally when we'd organized a trip by the founders to Microsoft to kind of really impress them how impressive Microsoft was. And apparently, the VCs in turn told them that Microsoft was doing it exactly for that reason. But at the end of that meeting, we approached them and said, we think you're worth around 200 million. And they were clearly not very happy with that. They then sent us a response providing, comparables with AOL and other, user-based platforms, and they had a price of 700 million on the last page. But apparently, as they were faxing that proposal back to us at that time, they decided to not put in that last page. And Greg Maffei was the person who was the CFO at that time, was leading the conversation with Sabir Bhatia at Hotmail. And fortunately for us, he had done a good job of telling Bill that this would be an expensive proposition. So it took some haggling, and they were at 700 million, I believe. We were at 200 million, and ultimately there's no magic number.
no.
It was there was no math that could justify 400 million. It was what was
Yeah.
negotiated. Is that
Yeah.
your recollection, Laura?
Yeah. I remember it as 375 being the final number, but it was a lot of money.
It was a lot of money. Yeah. Especially since they had little to no revenue at that point.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, um, post just kind of moving on to post Microsoft, Laura, you started Knack, went down the entrepreneurial journey, right?
I did.
For our audience, was there something in between you did, or you went from
Yes.
Microsoft to
Yeah.
Knack?
Yeah. No, I actually went to Atlas Venture.
Mm,
So I was VC for a while. So
mm,
Atlas at that point was the largest international venture firm in the
mm-hmm,
world.
mm-hmm,
And at that point, now they're I think almost exclusively life science, but then they had a telecoms practice, IT, and life science. And I took over the Menlo Park office, did also opened a Seattle office, and then managed the IT practice worldwide. So I did that for a couple of years. And I actually thought so there were a lot of different deals that we worked on. WebMD was another one. There's a lot of deal work that went along with the MSN role. And I really thought that I would enjoy being a VC.
mm,
And there were things that I liked about it. There are things
mm,
that are great about it.
mm,
But ultimately, that's where I learned I really enjoy being on the operating side. Ultimately,
mm,
I'm more of an operator than an
mm,
investor.
mm,
But I
mm.
did that for a couple of years.
You mentioned
And that's when
earlier
I invested in myself.
You mentioned earlier about your investment in Isilon, a very successful Seattle story, right?
Right.
Was that part of Atlas, or was it
It,
you? What
it
was
was
it?
part of Atlas. Yeah, it was, we did, ended up doing two deals in Seattle. Uh, and Iceland was one of them.
Hey, one out of
It
three.
made the fun. It made the fun to close those deals.
And it turned the fund in its entirety.
It
So
did.
you through that journey figured out that you want to be an operator, right? Or you enjoyed being an operator, not you want to be. You enjoyed being an operator. Tell us the story of how you hit on the idea for Knack, and what was the journey like, having worked at Microsoft for a long time and then being a VC back to, you know, early stage startup founder.
Yeah. So there was some time off in there too. Moved to
Hmm.
Europe, did some other things, came back. And then realized, boy, time is moving, right? So if I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I should probably get my act started. So was fascinated with the idea of how you can encapsulate and enable founders or creators of intellectual content. So the idea behind NAC was how do we allow everybody's an expert in something? How do you allow that expertise at the individual level to be shared, manipulated, possibly purchased by others, and have that attribution come back
Hmm.
to the individual creator?
Hmm.
So that started off as a gifting company, largely as a proof point for that idea. And I picked the corporate gifting business because it lent itself to kitting. The goods are shelf stable. But the idea was that we would create a technology platform that allowed people to put together whatever they want into these
Mm,
packages. And
mm,
then we would create them physically and we would create infrastructure around them.
mm,
It came with its own web page and it came with some other stuff. But the core idea was that whatever you had created was
mhm,
encapsulated as an object that can be shared, it
mhm,
can be manipulated by somebody else, and it can be purchased by somebody else with attribution back to the founder or to the creator. So that was the original idea. And my original thought was that we'd start in the corporate gifting space and then we'd move to another space that really lends itself to that kitting idea. So either clothing, outfits, or interior design. And then
mhm,
eventually it'd be a browser plugin. And
mhm,
so that's the original vision
mhm,
behind Mac.
mhm,
Now, it turns out that this is a kind of a story about pivoting
mhm,
because that initial test case turned out to be a really interesting market. And then COVID happened.
mhm,
And all of a sudden, it turned out to be for a couple of years, really, we're one of those just dumb luck businesses that were in the right place at the right time. So you see this exponential increase in gifting during the pandemic years. And
Hmm.
so I never did get around to options 2 and 3 and really started thinking about how do we build more and more of a virtual platform around this act of giving a physical gift and thinking about that and
Hmm.
what those products would look like is where I ended up going and never brought the idea into another test case. And then of course the pandemic helped things go up. And then the end of the pandemic, when people were like, okay, we've given enough gifts, we're done with this. What's next? That was a challenging time. And that's when we sold the company to another company down in Southern California.
Hmm. So, from an entrepreneurial journey, right? Um, so you had a very clear vision, or you had a vision, but and you were going down the path with with a series of steps. A macro event happens. You couldn't have, nobody could have predicted it. Macro event happens. So you had a choice to make at that point, as to how you're going to pivot, where you want to take it. Some of it you're pushed in, some of it you could have resisted. But there must have been a moment there saying, "Hey, we're going to ride this thing and just ride it to the top," because it was, even though there was some pause in the original vision and therefore the execution. So, what advice would you give entrepreneurs through that experience? Because macro events are going to happen to every entrepreneur. You know, if you're a gifting platform today, a tariff could have been a macro event that you couldn't have predicted, right? It's like a huge hit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think the advice is so specific to the macro event that it's hard to generalize. I can look back and think about the things I would have done differently. Um, I think thinking about more broadly about exit strategies, I focused a lot on the business and not about exiting the business and what that would look like. And that was a mistake in retrospect, really thinking about where this was going to go and who it would partner with and go to. At the same time, you had not only you had the pandemic, but you had the corporate gifting platforms that really came out of business development, right? So they call themselves gifting platforms, but they're really about how do we get people, their SDR, BDR tools, trying to get people to take meetings. And that was having its phase right about then. And that was eating into the pricing structure for my business. So there was
Hmm.
a lot going on there. And I think I could have done, it's very hard as an entrepreneur, you want to play with your business. It is so fascinating. The it's like having a baby,
Mm.
you want to look at it and make sure it's breathing and marvel about how wonderful it is and everything you do with that business, thinking about the strategy and the product and how great it can be really overwhelming. And I didn't pick my head up enough and really think uh clearly about it as a business because I was so enamored with it as a creator, as a founder.
Mm, mm, mm. That's a great point you brought up, right? Shirish and I talked to a lot of founders, and many uh, have long stints, like yourself, at big companies, right? So they go through this journey of what it is their vision is and their muscle memories that work. But you are pointing out that even though you had all this experience, all this muscle memory, there were spots that you could have, should have, would have focused on as an entrepreneur that you didn't have to because of, your experiences or other things.
Yeah, yes. In fact, I knew it at the time. There were times when I would say, because as a VC, I've been on I've been on lots of boards, right? I can spot the problems
Hmm.
that are going to come up and see the patterns. And there are times when in my head the board member in me is saying, "Do this," and the founder of me doesn't want to listen to that advice. So yes, you're exactly right. I knew better. Even after everything I had been through.
Mm-hmm.
When you are a clear-eyed board member and when
Mm-hmm.
you are actually the founder
Mm-hmm.
shepherding something you love, it is
Mm-hmm.
really easy
Mm-hmm.
to make mistakes because you
Yeah.
believe in your baby.
Yeah. Focused on what I would argue a fairly difficult market, right? Creators, convincing them to do things. There was a very, uh, you were creating new categories as you went along, so to speak. We talked to a lot of founders today who are, you know, I would say building a lot of tools, developer tools, etc. And it's easier to build because as AI makes progress, it's easier to build. But the fundamentals of operating a business are still the same. They're not changing that dramatically. You still need to convince your customers, figure out there's a need for the customer, the pricing is good. All those things don't are not changing. And your as you point out, right? You have to constantly decide what founder you have to be and who you're serving because you could serve
Right.
the board or you could serve your customer or you could serve your just building a product alone going to get there. It's going to get easier, I think, but it's not going to be automatic that your core reasons to exist as a business still remains the same. Looks like that's how you navigated the pandemic. Although it seems like it's a good thing, but it was a tough thing because you had new competitors who came into being during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's true. But and also, handling that scale of growth was challenging. We were going through warehouses like
Hmm.
no tomorrow. I mean, we'd get into a warehouse and think, "Oh, this is all we're going to need. This is so big." And then,
Hmm.
and building the technology to allow us to do that. And then eventually we ended up outsourcing, and that was a really interesting thing to go through. But ultimately, to your point, the big miss, no matter what business you're in, no matter what you're building, you better understand what your channel is.
Mm.
What is your channel? What is your go-to-market strategy? And you have to know that from the beginning. And uh, because I'm helping another person right now. I'm running the go-to-market strategy for a AI company in town now, and it's the same, fundamentally, completely different ICP, different technology, different use case. But the core problem of you better figure out what your channel is there. It's a business problem that transcends the technology.
Laura, I have to say that we named our podcast From Startup to Exit based on Shirish's first book he wrote called From Startup to Exit. There's a chapter on go to market and a chapter on product market fit that he wrote. I tell people don't read it like a book. I mean, it's not a book. You just keep it next to your side table and then you go through it because as a founder, you're alone. I mean, I tell founders, as a founder, I felt alone a lot of the time because it's all going back and forth. I couldn't tell which voice to listen. And I think the founder you're assisting is very fortunate that you've been a big company executive and an operator and a VC. That's a rare combination for a founder to land. I want to talk to that founder to understand how they landed you. But thanks a lot for spending time with us and sharing your story, Laura. Shirish, back to you.
Great. So I had one final question for you, Laura. My unfortunately, my son is an entrepreneur. Though he's a gym owner, he's not in the tech business. But we don't see many women as tech entrepreneurs. And I wonder, as I look forward to having grandkids, how do I, if some of them are female, how do I make them into entrepreneurs? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how do do you have to start early? What do you have to do?
That is so interesting because I think that women tend to be quite entrepreneurial in life, right? Figuring out how to make things happen.
Right.
Um, I can tell you one of the things that helped me. I belonged to a group of female CEOs in town. Most of them, at times it was very tech oriented. At times the group was a slightly larger. So there were tech and non-tech, but all female CEOs, different size companies. And we would get together once a month. And every month I would think, I cannot afford to do this. I got a business to run. This is not worth the 2 to 3 hours I'm going to spend on it. And every month it was the best 2 to 3 hours I spent. There's power in being able to have a place where you can talk about everything you're doing wrong with people who are also doing things wrong, and you can help each other. And so I think that's true of any founder, but I think it's particularly true for female entrepreneurs because you are trained not to show weakness in public. And so having this safe place where you can run ideas by, and sometimes they're hard things. You don't trust your co-founder anymore, or, just things that everybody runs into, but you need to have, particularly if you're early stage and your board isn't terribly experienced, you need a place where you can go and really talk about not only what's going right, which is what you're telling the world, and that's what you're telling your employees, but a
Yeah.
place where you can go. And sometimes there's nothing they can do but laugh and sympathize. Uh, but sometimes you get really great advice there. So I think that I would recommend that for any founder to have a place where you can go and be completely honest.
Yeah. Makes sense. So thank you so much, Laura. It was great chatting with you after 22, 23 years.
Yeah, we haven't changed at all.
Yeah. So glad you have had a very, very successful career, and I wish you all the best with your current startup that you're working with.
All right. Thank you. It was really nice to meet you, Gowri.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast From Startup to Exit, brought to you by TI Seattle. Assisting in production today are Eesha, Jain, and Minee Verma. Please subscribe to our podcast and rate our podcast wherever you listen to them. Hope you enjoyed it.